Greg, when we think of God, I'm told I have to think of a being that not only created the universe, but knows the future, knows exactly what's going to happen, indeed, has planned the future and controls the future. So the natural question that's asked is then, how do we have free will and the moral responsibility that free will would have to, we'd have to have in order that moral responsibility would make any sense? How do we deal with God knowing the future, supposedly, and free will?
Basically, there are 5 views about how God might know the future. And every one of them affirms that we do have moral responsibility. So the first view is the view that's traditionally associated with the Calvinists, although its origins go back to Augustine. And that's that we can be free even if our action is determined by something else, by God, or by the laws of nature. A lot of contemporary physicists and philosophers are going to hold this view, what we call a compatibilist view.
Because free will is compatible with the deterministic world, whether the deterministic world is from the physical events, one causing the other, in a purely naturalistic world, or whether God and God's ultimate wisdom has determined every event that's going to happen.
Exactly. It's a compatibilist view. And what does all the work here is the concept of freedom. What must freedom be like in order for us to have moral responsibility?
Doesn't sound like very much in that case.
Well, I'm not very sympathetic to this view.
All right, so that's one. You said there are 5. You got a lot more to go.
The other 4 views are incompatibilist views. If an action is determined, it cannot be free such that we could be morally responsible. So these are the ones that have the real problem reconciling God's knowledge of the future with human freedom.
Real freedom has to mean that we could do otherwise than what supposedly has been determined.
Exactly.
And if we can't do otherwise, then we're not free in a libertarian true sense.
That's exactly right. It's called libertarian freedom. So the first reconciling move is that God is outside time. So that God doesn't know literally ahead of time what we will do freely, but God's knowledge of the future is contemporaneous with the future action. So God's knowledge of what I will put in my coffee tomorrow is contemporaneous with me putting whatever it is in my coffee tomorrow.
Because to God, every event from the beginning of time to the end of time, and even if it's infinitely in the past and infinitely in the future, all of that God has in one extraordinary instant, if you will, or less than an instant. It's not even an instant.
In one eternal act of knowledge, everything is encompassed.
Okay.
So that's the outside of time view.
Okay.
And then there are a couple of views that are compatible with God being inside time. The first one we might call simple foreknowledge, that God can simply see what we are going to do, and it's still true that we could have done something different.
It's just like us looking out at the street and seeing somebody riding a bicycle on the right-hand side. We just see it.
We just see it.
We're not influencing it.
There's no causal relation from our side to the person riding the bicycle.
How God may see this, you don't care to give us a mechanism, because that'd be impossible. But it's just a simple foreknowledge.
It's a simple foreknowledge view.
Okay.
Right. The second view, one that's gaining a lot of popularity, is what we call the open view. And this is the view that the future is open, that what you will freely choose to do tomorrow is open in the sense that there is no truth about that yet. There are no truths about future contingent events that could go either way.
So we're not stepping on God's all knowledge, because
not at all.
At this point, there is no truth to know about what you're going to do tomorrow. So the fact that God doesn't know that doesn't make God less of a God.
Exactly. God still knows everything that can be known.
Because you can't know the future.
And if you can't know the future, nobody thinks that God knows how to draw a square circle. Mm-hmm. But nobody thinks that that's a limitation to God's knowledge, because there is no how to draw a square circle. And if the open view is true, then what we will freely do tomorrow, there's no truth about that. So it's not a limitation on God. It's just adjusting how many things he knows in terms of what we normally expect
Okay.
him to know. The
People
traditional
talk about
view.
that as a true becoming.
Yes.
That the world and all that's in it truly becomes in a way that is open, is uncertain, and is real.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly. And there's a fundamental asymmetry between the future and the past.
Mm-hmm.
The past is fixed. It's closed. There are no leftover contingencies. It could have been different, but what it is fixed. The future is not fixed in that way on this view.
You have one more left.
One more view. It's called middle knowledge, sometimes called Molanism, after Alfred Molina, who was the first person to articulate this view. And it's very complicated. And it goes like this. There are 3 steps in God's knowledge. First, and this is not necessarily chronological steps.
Explanatory steps.
Explanatory steps. God knows everything that's necessary. Things like 1 + 1 = 2. If something is a frog, it's an amphibian. All of these necessary relationships. And
that's something that you don't have to think about because it's by necessity.
It's by necessity. And that's not controversial. God also knows everything that's true, everything that's going to happen. So this morning, I drank a cup of coffee. I did that freely. God knows that that's the case because it's fixed. The middle knowledge falls explanatorily between these 2 kinds of knowledge. And that is that God knows what every free creature would do in every given situation. So
would is the operative word.
Would.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's a counterfactual.
It's a counterfactual.
Meaning that all the different ways you could have done things, God
That's
knows
right.
all of that constellation.
So God knows that if I had gotten up at 6 o'clock this morning, I would have made a bigger pot of coffee than I actually made.
Okay.
And so it's counterfactual because I didn't get up at 6 o'clock. I got up at 7 and I made a moderate pot of coffee. And
So God knowing that, God would have had to take that middle knowledge, so-called, prior to God creating the universe and all that exists, right?
yes,
And have used that information to choose the world that God wanted.
exactly, Robert. That's exactly how this connects to God knowing the future. So if God knows, for example, in world 1, I get up at 6, in world 2, I get up at 7, and he wants me to make a really big pot of coffee for some reason, I can't imagine why, God would make sure that world 1 was actual, because he knew if it's world 1, I'm going to do this. So God knows what I'm going to do based on the fact that he chooses these worlds as he's choosing to create.
Well, let me tell you what my problems are with that. The first problem is, although God is all-powerful, I recognize that, the permutations of every would across all the people who have ever lived and maybe all other things that have ever existed, the permutations of all of that is so beyond astronomical. There is no number using infinity as many times as you want that can express the number of possible worlds that would have. The number is so outrageously absurd that it seems to defy belief. I would be shocked if reality were so structured. I mean, that's my first reaction.
Right.
My second reaction is, okay, even if I give you that, even if I give it to you, the fact that God knew that back then, it's impossible for me now to do otherwise, even though God knew what I would have done as a free creature. It seems like it's a circular reasoning at that point.
It does. And I think that's exactly where lots of the pressure gets put on this view, is that it seems as though those acts can't really be free.
Yeah.
Because if God puts me in world 2 and I'm freely choosing how much coffee to make, isn't it the case that in world 2, it's up to me? In other words, I could make a big pot of coffee or I could make a moderate pot of coffee. And on the middle knowledge view, it closes that option.
You're done. Your history.
That's
buddy.
right. And I think that's the biggest objection to this view.
I see a motivation here, and here's the tension. The tension is between what kind of God do you as a theist want? Do you want a God who really has created a universe with genuine human free will? Right. Or do you want a God that has absolute providential control of history and development and has 100% certainty that things will come out the way God wants? And you know what? You can't have them both.
I think you're right. I think that's the tension between these two views. I think the critics of the open view are trying to say that God can't be sovereign. But on every one of these views, there's actually a high degree of sovereignty for God.